Today's quite special for you, really, because your new book's out. I believe it's called Both. The last book, I think, was must be about two years ago. That was called She's Alone, and from what I remember, it was sort of science fiction based on what would happen to the last woman on Earth, and how she would survive. Anyway, later on, I'm going to record you and the lads, and but before then, rather than just go straight into the event, I'd like you to just sort of explain the plot for Both, since you will be doing some of that this evening.
Both is a novel that was written between the end of 2003 and earlier this year in 2010, and it should be available over the course of the next week by the 24th of April at the latest. It is, unlike She's Alone, set in more or less contemporary reality, to be specific, between the autumn of 2002 and autumn of 2003. It's a much longer novel than She's Alone, with, well, arguably 9 different narrators of different attitudes, belief systems, sexes, ages. I've tried to make them as varied as possible. It started out, though, as a comparatively simple story of a woman who spent her first 10 years between about 1960 and 1970 as the daughter of a notorious occult magician, and then, having been taken into care, adopted by a family of devout evangelical Christians. I was interested, obviously, in what that would do to a person, what kind of belief system they'd wind up with, how their mental health had held up under those particular contradictory pressures. I started to write it, didn't get very far, it didn't seem to be working when I was just writing it from the woman's point of view. Things started to look up when first of all I brought in her adoptive brother, the very devout Paul, who narrates a lot of the story and is very, I hope, sympathetic, if extremely, how shall I put it, extremely arrogant character. He is, despite his arrogance, very well-meaning, very likeable, but one who makes a lot of mistakes, gets things dreadfully wrong in his relationships with the people around him. Later on, I brought in a close friend of my heroine's, named Dougie, a man who believes that his previous girlfriend was murdered due to his inability to talk her out of giving up a destructive relationship that she was in. Then other characters started to take shape around them, including a grotesque, mentally grotesque, but ultimately tragic occult magician, friend of the heroine's father, and her other siblings and relatives. The story is very non-committal in terms of whether anything supernatural is going on or not. It is entirely up to the reader to decide whether this is something that is genuinely mystical, whether there is any truth in either of the religious or metaphysical systems that are being preached, or whether it is entirely delusory.
Richard Clay and the frozen Nile, or part of the frozen Nile. Here we go. Big round of applause. Thank you.
silence of graves. It has its own special quality. There can be birdsong, wind in the trees, traffic the other side of the churchyard wall. Still, that grave silence makes its own particular space. There's an emptiness you can feel. The birds are chirping, as you'd expect. The wind is blowing, as you'd expect. The traffic is roaring, as you'd expect. But what of the people you know who are buried here? What are the words you expect from them? Not a peep to be had. And so, you begin to grieve. But what sort of grief will it be? There are several kinds. One is the grief of unfulfillment. You don't grieve for their death so much. It's the silent emptinesses before death that bother you. The silent emptinesses where lives should have been. Mum and Dad's grave was a neat affair, neither showy nor modest. Black marble. It had cost a lot, but then monuments do. Choosing a cheap gravestone means you're taking a stand against what's expected. After Mum and Dad had gone, I didn't feel like taking a stand against anything. Taking a stand seemed a pretentious idea, surplus to requirements. They were silent now, silent as they had always been. I'd never worked out how or why they got together. I suppose then I never worked out any convincing reason for my own existence. Funny that. I'd lived with them for 18 years before I went to university, then another 8 after I came out of Nick. In all that time I never heard either of them say a kind word to the other. Not that there were many unkind words. They didn't have rows. They just never talked to each other much. They never seemed interested in each other. Neither of them seemed to see this as a problem. Mum in particular sometimes said how pleased she was to have a happy home. And if you compared her with a lot of people on our estate, she seemed to be talking sense. In our house, you never got any swearing, nor any chucked crockery, accusations or threats. Just that silence. That polite disinterest. Dad would sometimes hold forth when he got a bee in his bonnet about something. Mum would just sit there as if she was waiting for an LP she didn't like particularly to get to the end of the groove. But he was out in the garden for the most part, doing stuff. And she was around the house for the most part, cleaning stuff. Their paths only really crossed at dinner, which was a bit of an ordeal for both of them. They'd sit at opposite ends of the table, doing their best to fill up the silence with polite, inconsequential words, both desperate to be away from here, so they didn't have to go on staring into that space where there ought to have been a marriage. Silence then, silence now. Nothing's been lost. There was nothing to lose. You could stand for hours by the graveside shaking with grief, though they'd both been gone 5 years or so. But it's not the loss of them you're grieving for. Both of them made it into their 70s, and you suppose that's not bad going. Their deaths you can live with. Their lack of lives before death you can't. Why should it have been like that? Neither of them were bad people. They deserved lives. So why had they both believed so absolutely that all they could ever hope for were existences?